So, today we are talking about politics, one of the most complicated things that you can ever choose to talk about. And disclaimer, actually, first of all, awesome to have our guests here. Can we give a little round of applause to our brothers from Seattle? Made it all the way here. We are so honored to have you guys here. And we're bummed that you can't stay for Sunday, but, you know, it's all good. Someday you'll make it to Sunday too. Actually, well, Serge, you've been there, but you guys haven't been to our Sunday service, right? Okay. Cool. Okay, so we are talking about politics today. We have a lot of ground to cover. Before we dive in, I want to get a disclaimer out there. It's one of the most complicated subjects. I've spent the whole couple of months reading on it and connecting dots from things I've read in the past couple of years. My conclusions here are not perfect at all. This is not a perfectly formulated system of ideas. This is a rough draft of me starting to try to connect the dots. So, totally open to your guys' feedback, critique, and at any time, you can interrupt me, raise a hand, and ask away. But the hope here is that we can start to think about how we formulate some foundational biblical categories and biblical principles of how we think of politics. The problem with politics is oftentimes we've started thinking about politics from the top down. So we started with all the policies. You know, Christians think about, abortion is wrong, and we have to oppose same-sex marriage, and so all the issues, right, the policy issues. But a lot of times what is missing among Christians is thinking about politics from the bottom up, starting from a biblical theological perspective, from an understanding of what the Bible says, and then from there working up to the specific issues. So, the bulk of this evening is not about policies. It's not about telling us how we should vote on this or that question. It's more about laying that groundwork. And hopefully, we make it fast enough through all this content. We'll talk about some more specific stuff that's surrounding us and hear more questions about specifics. Our first and deepest need is to think biblically, and from the biblical categories to start to think practically. So, a couple of book recommendations that I really want to let you guys know about. First of all, Jonathan Leeman. He's a Baptist pastor. He's a really, really great guy. And he has an excellent book. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about today is borrowing, adapting from a lot of the stuff he covers in his book. It's called How the Nations Rage, Rethinking Faith and Politics in a Divided Age. And Wayne Grudem has a big book on politics. And Wayne Grudem is really good at overview of everything. So Wayne Grudem gives you the roadmap. He helps you see the big picture stuff. So, get your hands on those books. How the Nations Rage is a great one to have on audio if you're an audiobook guy. I've listened to it on audio like 3 times. Excellent stuff. So, an overview, kind of a basic overview of what we want to talk about today, and a very simple framework, but something that we want to have in our minds as we're thinking about this. When we think about politics and government, we are talking about one of the ways in which God is responding to a broken world, right? So in Genesis 3, we see the fall, and then God responds to the fall through a variety of ways, and it culminates in the flood. And then after the flood, God makes like a renewed commitment to his creation. And in that, we see biblical principles of law, justice that God requires from people among each other. So, God is responding to the sin and brokenness of the world. And he's responding in 2 main ways. First way he's responding is he gives government to enforce justice and create balance in society so that sin doesn't just go crazy. So God ordains government, and God also is working to save, right? That's the plan of salvation. We know that very well. God is working through Jesus, through his plan of salvation, to turn around the sinful heart and bring it back to himself. So these are two parallel and interconnected ways that God is working to respond to sin. So when we're talking about politics, we are talking about a subcategory here of God's purpose and how he's responding to a broken world. And we will come back to this little thing over and over in our outline. So, biblical foundation for government. I don't know if many of you have noticed, but when you read the book of Genesis in chapter 9, like I just said, when Noah gets off the flood, after the flood, gets off of the ark, and God blesses them again, almost the same as he does in Genesis 1. But in that process, God also gives a specifically ordained system of retributive justice. So Genesis 9, 5-7, God says this, and I'll read it. And I will require a penalty for your lifeblood. I will require it from any animal or any human. If someone murders a fellow human, I will require that person's life. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans, his blood will be shed. For God made humans in his image. But you, be fruitful and multiply. Spread over the whole earth and multiply on it. So this passage, as they're getting off of the ark, God is blessing them to have dominion over the world, to spread out into the world. But he's adding this little piece that wasn't there before. Here God is saying, I will require justice from someone who kills another person. And so a lot of Christian theologians historically have seen this as the foundational God-ordained passage in the very beginning where God ordains human government, human power structures that help control and punish evildoing. So when you look at this passage, you see a couple of principles here that the Bible basically gives us at the very outset of why governments exist. Why do governments exist from God's perspective? First of all, like we just said, to render judgment for the sake of justice. So the world is broken. There's a lot of killing and violence and law breaking, and God says, I'm going to require humanity to execute justice, however imperfect that justice may be. So the purpose of government is to control corruption, to push back against evil and the spread of sin in humanity. Romans 13:4, Paul says this, for it is God's servant, it meaning the government, it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason, for it is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. So Paul is saying that God ordains the Roman authorities in their day, the governments. God ordains these people and these forces and these political structures. They're serving God, even though they don't know they're serving God. From a theological perspective, Paul is telling the churches, he's saying, you have to look at government from this perspective. God has instituted these things to control sin and to punish evil. Second of all, government builds platforms for peace, ordering, and flourishing. So when we read our Bibles in Genesis 1, God sends out Adam and Eve to take over the world, to have dominion, to cultivate the garden, right, to exercise that authority. Whereas it's interesting because God sends that, again, same passage in Noah, with Noah in Genesis 9, he's sending them out. But at the same time, God is also instituting this means of authority among men, this requirement for justice for wrongdoing. And so what is happening here is God is inserting a requirement for justice as he is sending Noah out to do what Adam was supposed to do, but now Noah is going out into a broken world. And there's a requirement for these governmental structures of power and justice. But the requirement helps fulfill the mandate. Go and be fruitful. Go and multiply. Go and exercise dominion over the world. So when we talk about government creates this structure in the world so that we can live our human lives, so we can be flourishing, so that business can happen, so people can be fruitful, so we can exercise our gifts, so humanity can be humanity in the world, even though the world is broken. So government is supposed to build platforms for peace, ordering, and flourishing. And finally, it sets the stage for redemption. God institutes government in this world. In that moment with Noah, there is an implied big assumption in the whole story with Noah. God says, the world is broken, I'm going to destroy it, right? But then after the flood, God looks at Noah and says, they're still broken, they're still corrupt, but I'm still committed to creation. So there's a storyline at work. God has a plan to bring back his creation to himself. God has a plan to counter the effect of sin. And so within this structure of this passage that we just read, there's this assumption. It's setting the stage. It's opening the door. And then 4 chapters later, you have God calling Abraham. So God institutes the purposes of government. And again, if we had time, we can run through dozens of passages in Proverbs, in the Old Testament, and all these passages where the Bible constantly talks about kings ruling with justice, kings being accountable to God, kings blessing the world when they are wise and execute justice among the people, kings leading to blessing and flourishing and multiplication among the civilization that they're over. So that's the biblical assumptions behind government. So when we talk about how do laws work then? How do we make decisions about what is correct justice versus incorrect justice, right? In the Bible, you have two types of responses to man-made law. First of all, and this is borrowing off a scholar whose name I forgot, but Jonathan Leeman quotes him as well. It's a really helpful way to categorize it. When it comes to justice, we have straight line issues and we have jagged line issues. So straight line issues are clear. God hates murder. That's very clear. A government that celebrates murder is unjust, right? So there's clear straight line issues that the Bible talks about, the sanctity of life, God's precious kind of protection over marriage, like all these different things that are very clear in the Bible. This is sin if you do this, right? This is wrong among all civilizations, among all people. Family structure, racism, murder, sexual morality, these things are very clear. But there's also jagged line issues, right? What kind of government is the best kind, Or environment, how does humanity respond and take care of the environment? What kind of tax measures are the best type of tax? What kind of leaders or sub-leaders do you appoint, right? These are all issues which most of politics includes, and they are issues that they require a combination of biblical principles and human wisdom and honest an understanding of the information to come together to create justice in society. For example, when it comes to taxes, there is a biblical principle that says that the rulers should not rob the people, right? It's an evil king overtaxes people and basically becomes like state-sponsored stealing. Oftentimes, as Christians, that's our clear perspective on socialism, where basically people are deprived of private property. Everything they have to give up, everything they have to give in, and then the government just does whatever it feels best with the money. So there's that's more of a clear principle. But then when we're talking about taxes in general, there's so many other ideas that come into play. So wisdom and correct thinking in these areas, it requires homework. It requires thinking about connecting the dots and what are the biblical principles at play here about taxes? What are the biblical principles on foreign policy? How can we think about this? Or what is the correct information and data about climate change and our relationship to the environment or whatever, right? So jagged line issues, they require a lot of work to think about and to understand, right? And so most of politics is a lot of jagged line issues. Most of politics is areas where people can disagree and where people can push back and forth. But the common ground, among Christians especially, right, is that we base our thinking on biblical principles and on biblical responses to ideas and truth that we put together, right? So just because the Bible doesn't clearly tell us how to do taxes, then we can do whatever we want, right? That's not true. Just because the Bible doesn't condemn drug use specifically, it doesn't mean that we can just decide whatever we want with the law, right? There's biblical principles that come into play. But this requires work. This requires understanding, and this requires arguing back and forth. Our political context today, we're very prone to oversimplifying everything. And oftentimes Christians, especially a lot of us, and I'm not saying that, immigrants are not informed. Many of us, I'm sure, are very informed. But as an immigrant population, we've gotten involved in politics maybe over the last 5 years. There's a lot of things that we haven't learned about the information, the background, so there's a lot to learn. Christians easily start dividing over stuff because we oversimplify what is a straight line issue and what is a jagged line issue, So, decision-making and justice in a fallen world can be complicated. So third of all, we get to kind of the heart of the paradox, the political tension of being a Christian. I think that one of the things that if I'm hoping for us to walk away with today, and that is an honest grasp at why is it that our thoughts, our conversations, our involvement in politics often feels so difficult and strained, right? It's so difficult to see a clear answer to a lot of the political issues all around us. And so, why is that? Well, politics in a broken world is paradoxical. It's a paradox. So, remember Jesus' famous words, right? We preached on this passage a few months ago. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. So Jesus said in that statement, again, we've heard that statement so many times, we're like, yeah, whatever, Caesar, Caesar, God, God's. But when Jesus said that statement, that was revolutionary. Because what he does in this statement is Jesus is legitimizing the authority and power of Caesar, even though Caesar is a pagan ruler who does not acknowledge God. Jesus is saying, and obviously in this statement, Jesus is saying that if look, when we're looking at the context, and he says whose image is on the coin, it's Caesar's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, God what is God's. In that passage, when he says that word image, it's kind of echoing back to Genesis, the image of God imprinted on man. So you can even make the argument, it's Caesar's image on the coin, but whose image is on Caesar is God. So God is still in charge. God is Lord over everyone. But here Jesus is saying that under this umbrella of God's total power, you have earthly rulers like Caesar, pagan, not acknowledging God, doing whatever he wants. And yet Jesus says Caesar's authority is legitimate. You have to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, pay taxes. And so when we read the New Testament, right, Romans 13 we've already looked at. It's interesting because the New Testament says very little about politics, and what it does say about politics, it mostly says respect the authorities. And when we talk about authorities, today we complain about, corrupt rulers and crazy liberals or whatever, right? But in their time, you've got Roman, their authorities were way more corrupt than ours and pagan. And the New Testament talks about the power of pagan rulers is legitimate. It's not only legitimate, it is ordained by God. So, that brings us to that paradox. How is it that God says that Caesar's power is legitimate, even though Caesar doesn't acknowledge God? How is it that we need to respect authorities who are themselves disrespecting God, right? That's kind of the central tension even in the New Testament. The New Testament talks about respecting the rulers, and yet in the New Testament we see Christians both respecting rulers and disobeying rulers respectfully, right? So one of our assumptions is, we're quick, especially in America. I think Russians I don't know how, I'm not enough informed about our how Russian folks were back in Russia during the Soviet Union in their relationship to authorities. But in America, we're very quick to critique the authority, to say it's not that significant and not that important because these are secular rulers, Democrats, progressives, they're godless, they support abortion. Or we might kind of say something like, isn't it inevitable when a government does not acknowledge God, that government goes against God's word, that this government is going to fall, right? So isn't it inevitable that if American society, so one of the big fears right now, right, that if America keeps becoming more and more secular, that it's just going to fall into chaos because it's going away from its Christian roots, because the only real kind of civilization that can last is a civilization built on Christian principles, not on secular principles, right? Well, the answer to that is confusing. The answer to that is, historically, people have had very bad beliefs, but they've had long and successful kingdoms. And people have had very good beliefs and very unsuccessful kingdoms, right? Politics in a broken world, God ordains crooked politicians, crooked rulers, and God gives them power. God raises them up to their power, God gives them power, and God works through them to accomplish his work in the world. So government in the fallen world is always going to be broken. We have to resist the urge to think that we can replace the broken system with a perfect one. All government in a fallen world is a broken government to an extent. And it only works because God ordained. And it will continue to work until God ordained it. So America will fall apart, in a sense, obviously. If America is destructive and goes against God's law, it'll fall apart. It'll see more chaos. But at the same time, America will fall apart when God ordains it to fall apart. So part of the answer is how do governments, why do they stand up then? Why do they keep existing if they're so corrupt and they rebel against God's word? Well, because common grace. We've heard that theological phrase before, common grace. God's common grace means that God provides stability and order into the world even though people are sinful. God gives sun and rain and good food and success and well-being to the sinful world. Through that, God is showing his goodness, and God is upholding the world. And God upholds the world through crooked leaders. So that's why the New Testament writers are both supporting government and resisting government when needed. So the paradox, again, keeps going, right? As we say, God uses crooked leaders, but also God judges rulers when they drive outside their appointed lanes. So we still have a limit. We still have a limit in the Bible. Governments are allowed to function within a certain means, and they have a purpose, God said, for justice, for flourishing, and to pave the way for the work of redemption. But we see examples like Acts 12. Remember that crazy story with Herod. He came out, people were saying, this is the voice of a God. And he's just like, yes, I'm amazing. I am God. And the angel Gabriel sends a plague, and the man is eaten by worms. That's crazy. But it's a story where we see a clear demonstration that God judges rulers who don't function according to their... And it's funny because it's interesting in that story, because you read that story and you think, okay, wait, so God judged him for taking worship to himself and not acknowledging God. God didn't judge Herod for being a non-Christian king, specifically, or else he would have judged every other ruler of that time, and since then and before then. God judged Herod for receiving worship as if he is God, and God came in and crushed him. You see the same thing in the Old Testament, right? In the Old Testament, it's interesting. God uses pagan rulers, the king of Babylon. God says, the king of Babylon is my servant. He is going to come and he is going to punish you guys. When he's talking to Israel. He's my servant. He is accomplishing my will. Babylonian army comes, wipes them out. In the meantime, the Babylonian army is being perverse and raping and murdering children and doing crazy stuff. And then God turns around and says, I will judge you, Babylon, and I will destroy you for your sin. So there's a paradox. And I hope we kind of see that tension. We feel that tension. Because that is the tension of politics in a broken world. Oftentimes we think maybe if our government was more Christian, right? Like, what's the goal? This is the question that I've been wrestling with over and over for the past couple of years. What is our goal in our political endeavors? Like, okay, as Christians, we're voting, we're putting people into office. What is the end game? What are we trying to do? Or another way to ask the question, if we were the original Americans who landed here, right? And we were writing the Constitution, what is the Christian way to build a society? The crazy thing is the New Testament does not give us instructions on how to build the kingdom of God on earth out of human governments. It doesn't. What it does is it challenges us to live faithfully in the midst of whatever government system where we find ourselves. But if we think that if only we had all Christian presidents and all Christian people in the White House and all Christian governors, and if our Constitution said, Jesus is king, then we would be way more prosperous as a country. I would challenge that assumption because, first of all, we'll get to it. We're crossing an interesting tension. Again, we hit the paradox of the separation of church and state. But one thing that we also miss is that in the history of the West, we have had Christian governments. And we have had Christian rulers, explicitly Christian rulers. And we have had times when you have had Christian governments who had more injustice than secular governments. So there isn't the clear answer of this is the easy solution. As Christians, involved in a broken world in politics, you always face this paradox, this tension. And that's one of the most key things to realize. If we don't realize that, we will be always gunning for a perfect expectation and always frustrated with what we're getting at. So, God judges rulers. Pause for questions. Any questions, comments before we move on to phase 2? Thoughts? Moving on. You guys can interrupt me anytime if needed. So what we've done is we looked at 4 points. If you look in your outline, it's all there, right? We've looked at 4 points that are kind of the bird's eye view, the top down. Basic structures, basic ideas, right? Now we want to look at from the ground up. As Christians on the ground, how do we experience the political world, right? First of all, the 5th point is politics is a battleground of the gods, and I spelled small g gods on purpose. So when we see the biblical guidelines, it's very clear, right? Governments are pretty neutral. They're supposed to uphold justice, let people live peaceably, and just kind of mind your own business. Why is politics so messy then? Why is politics so vicious? Why is every era of human history, you have people murdering each other, and politics is driving the killing and the violence, right? Because in the fallen world, nothing that we do is neutral. Everything that we as humans do is about worship. Everything that we do has a reason behind it. Everything that we do, we are motivated, right? So you think about anything that you do, whether it's getting up for work, or whether it's getting up in the middle of the night to feed your baby, or whether it's mowing the lawn or paying your taxes. Everything we do, if you dig deep enough, there's a reason behind it, and that reason has to do with our vision of what the good life is. We pursue a certain picture of the good life, and everything that we do is ordered about that, right? So we live for a purpose. We live for a destination. We are always defending some set of beliefs, those beliefs that we think will bring us happiness, right? That is what it means to be human. when we talk about worship, worship is not just bowing down to a pagan idol or singing praises to Jesus. Worship is taking something and exalting it as the main object of your hopes and your desires, and believing that that thing will be the thing which makes me happy, satisfied, feeling whole, right? So whatever it is in our broken world, idolatry can be about money, pleasure, success, power, whatever it is. So everyone is pursuing something. So when we talk about politics, politics is just the public expression of everybody's picture of the good life. Everybody's little God is moving them to defend that God's ideas and rights. People fight for laws. People want to reorder society. Why? Because they want to make a society in which their God reigns and they get to live according to the picture of the promise of this God. So in our world, in our culture today, the self could be argued the main God that animates culture. Self. Whatever it is, my sexuality, my gender, my career, right? All these things have to do with the self. The way I see myself, the way I define my life, and nobody is allowed to get in the way of myself, right? So, politics is a battleground of the gods. Why is politics so vicious, especially today? Because in a secular world, people have in many ways are losing attachment to official religion, capital R religion, but they're still attaching their hopes, longings, and dreams to small r religion or secular religion. And so these things that we're pursuing, this is what, clearly you can see this in our progressive, militant, secular, progressivist agenda, right? People are fighting for, sexual, reproductive rights, gay rights, all this stuff. Why is it so vicious? Because this is their faith. This is what gives people their sense of wholeness and their sense of understanding of what life should be like. It's a religion. And so politics is the battleground of the gods. Politics is where everybody brings their gods and fights over their vision of the good life. Why is this important? Well, first, there's two clear implications here. First of all, what we talk about when we hear in the world around us, that there is this public-private split, right? We have the public life is the neutral place, but then there's the private life. So you can do whatever you want in private, live your private life, but, keep your religion to yourself. And in the public world, it's more of the neutral ground. That public-private split is a myth, right? Because everything that we are in public, it's only just the outflow of what we are in private. Everything that we do on the outside is only what we worship on the inside, right? And there's no such thing as non-religious or neutral. Everybody is worshiping. Everybody is pursuing gods. Now, in our world, it's very difficult. This is one of the most difficult things for secular people to understand. People who don't adhere to an official religion like Christianity or Islam or something. It is extremely difficult for them. It is truly like they don't see it. It is very difficult for them to see that when they say, I don't want you to force your religion on society, they are forcing their religion in that very moment, right? Everyone is enforcing some sort of moral order on everybody else, right? So there's no such thing as neutral. There's no such thing as non-religious. It's impossible to separate religion from politics. That's the key. We always want to say, people worship whatever they want, but, politics is kind of a neutral ground. It's the neutral table at which everybody gathers and kind of talks about how they want to share the world. In reality, you can't separate politics and religion. In reality, we're always living out policies, ideas, presidents, governments based on our religion, based on our deepest beliefs. And again, this brings us back to the tension, the paradox. The paradox is this. How does God ordain rulers? Like, God opposes idolatry, obviously. But then God ordains rulers who are idolaters. And he allows them to be kings and rulers and presidents. And what is our whole role in this process? Is our role to change the laws and to oppose idolatrous rulers? Or is our role as Christians to evangelize and change hearts, right? That's kind of the two different trajectories that we're always kind of torn in. And the answer to both of those is yes. Our role is both. Our role is to impact laws. Our role is to impact hearts. So this brings us to another question. What is the relationship between church and state? So we just said that it's impossible to separate politics and religion, right? So then what is the relationship? Because they are sort of separate still. Like we believe them to be in separate spheres, obviously. We don't believe that the bishops or pastors or rabbis of any religion should be the ones telling the president how to do things. We believe in some sort of separation. So there's a couple of ways that we can see this, and I've kind of printed out on your outline too. So notice how, and again, I got this from Jonathan Leeman's book. It's really, really helpful little picture. So you have two different spheres or jurisdictions. So the little black thing is jurisdictions. So the area of authority of the church. Where is the church in authority, right? Versus where is the government in authority, right? And then you have the lines. The lines represent, so the horizontal lines are political realities, and the vertical lines are religious realities, right? So some people believe that politics and religion are totally separate, just like in this picture. Completely separate entities, different areas, don't care, worship whatever you want, but that's not what we do in politics. Politics is not religion. Most people probably hold to something like this. They believe that politics and religion are very separate, but there's some overlap. For example, we have to make laws that protect religion, right? So in that sense, there's a little bit of overlap where the government says, okay, guys, you get to worship whatever you want, and you can't enforce your religion on other people. So that's a law about religion. So there's a very small little overlap, but mostly they don't overlap. Mostly they're just about your private life. Many, many Christians over the last 50 years, in America especially, kind of held to this view. You can read, when people, as Christians, they don't formulate a whole worldview, when they don't formulate like your understanding of God and creation and sin and redemption, that picture, it impacts how you see everything. It impacts how you see policy. It impacts how you see maybe taxes, wages, abortion, reproductive rights, right? Obviously, your Christian worldview impacts everything. But oftentimes, people, they compartmentalize and say, well, that's just my religion. It's just my private thing. And I make my decisions about politics and policy on a totally different set of merits. That is a mistaken view. I think this is a mistaken view. But many, many people hold to this view. The vast majority of history held to this view. So most of history, if you look at, when did we have religious freedom? In America, technically, if you look at the beginning of America, there was a lot of religious freedom had to be argued in America for certain groups. So a bunch of Puritans came over, and the Puritans were mostly Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians were state-sponsored churches. And they had to figure out, we do have some Jews living in Massachusetts. Okay, how do we help the Jews not get persecuted? Or Baptists were persecuted by Presbyterians for a long time. So this blend was most of history. Most of history, there was an assumption. The king decides the religion. And anybody who opposes the religion of the king is opposing the king himself. And the king either, is instructed by the Pope, or the king himself is the leader of the religion. So, for example, in Great Britain, in the UK, there's a long, when the UK split from the Roman Church, and they became Protestant, sort of. It was called the Anglican Church. King, whoever, I think it was George or Henry or whatever his name is, I forget the exact king. But this king wanted to do this because, why? He wanted to divorce his wife. Rome didn't let him, so he made his own church, the Anglican Church. And he invited the Reformed guys, and he's like, hey, I'm going to be cool with you guys. You guys come over here, and I'll protect you from Rome. But he's like, but I'm going to be the head of the church. So all of a sudden, he kind of gave him a deal, but then he roped him into a very bad situation. The king is the head of the church. So this is the most of history. Most of history and so much bloodshed because of this perspective. The right perspective. There's always a right perspective, right? We're biblical people. We always have biblical answers to everything. But I believe this is a much more realistic perspective in how we should see things. Political and religious things are interconnected. It's one circle, one world, one society, one culture, right? What you believe about God spills over to how you treat your neighbor, spills over to how you vote, spills over to everything. You can't separate religion and politics, even though they are distinct, right? And the church is separate from the government and has its own different sphere, but the church has jurisdiction over political things and religious things, right? So, for example, the church in Nazi Germany had to come. There was a moment when a biblical wing of the church had to stop and say, it was like, the frog is getting boiled in the water, and so Hitler is rising to power, and they're like, oh, okay, Hitler's friendly with the churches, cool. But then they start to see more and more of who he is, and they're like, wow, we can't support this guy. So they had to stop and say, Christians must oppose this political ruler. That's a political statement that they made, right? It was a political statement based on theology, based on the Word of God, based on straight line issues. That this man was a tyrant, that this man was a murderer. So the jurisdiction, the little black thingy, is the authority of the church. The authority of the church, it falls on all the things that we teach about, all of life. But it's still distinct, right? It's not the same thing as government. So as Jonathan Leeman says, all of life is both political and religious because we are both political and religious creatures. But church and state possess distinct God-given authorities within distinct jurisdictions. So God calls the church and the state to different jobs. So remember our little outline earlier. There's two things God is doing in the world to counter sin, right? Did I put up here? Yeah. God is doing two things. God is controlling sin through government, and God is spreading redemption and heart transformation through his plan of salvation, which is the church. Both of these things are political, right? God is allowing governments, even corrupt ones, but also God is spreading the gospel, and through the gospel, he's changing hearts. And when somebody's heart is changed, they don't worship Caesar anymore because they know Jesus is Lord. But they'll respect Caesar to the extent that Caesar drives in his lane. So God is doing these things. But government stays in number one, right? Government is not the tool that God is using to spread salvation. That's not why God made government. And vice versa, the same thing happens. The church is not called to execute justice. The church is not called to wield the sword, right? The church is not called to be the police in the world. The church has a specific, distinct focus. We are here to make disciples, to proclaim Jesus as the King, and to call people to follow him. So our mission is number two, not number one, as the church specifically. When we talk about our community as a whole, when we're talking about the statement of pastors and church leaders, right? This is where you get a little bit into that dicey neighborhood. The church's focus is the gospel. So, let me see here. But also, so the church's focus is the gospel. The government's focus is justice. But they do overlap because sometimes the church has to tell the government that it is standing in the wrong place, that is going in the wrong place. So maybe many of you have heard that really amazing YouTube video, seen the YouTube video of John Piper's little 5-minute statement to Barack Obama when he, I think it's talking about basically gay marriage and abortion. Or was it abortion? Anyways, it was in a sermon that John Piper said, and it was like a whole thing, and it starts with, "No, Mr. President, that is not true." And he just goes down the line, speaking directly to the president, again, through his sermon, saying that this is injustice, and this is wrong, right? So, the church occasionally has something to say to the government. The government occasionally has something to say to the church. But overall, they have distinct spheres. Why is this important? Because the church can compromise its witness if the church doesn't understand that it is called specifically for the proclamation of the gospel and not for the enforcement of justice. When the church attaches itself to specific political policies, the church is attaching those policies to the name of Jesus. So you better be sure about it when you do. Those pastors in Nazi Germany, they had to take a stand. They had to say, you can't be a Christian and follow this Hitler, right? So they were making a statement. They were saying, you cannot follow Jesus and Hitler at once. So they were attaching to the gospel call this specific application. Can't be a Nazi, right? And I think they were right. That was a correct assumption, right? But very easily, I think this is rampant in American church, in American evangelicalism, where Americans and American politics is so intertwined with American faith that very often there's a blurring of the lines. And you have pastors saying things like, and again, I cautiously say this, but pastors saying things like, I don't see how you can be a Christian and vote for this person. Again, when you say that, you better be pretty sure that anybody who votes for that guy, no matter how terrible he is basically saying that they're not a Christian, right? The church has to be extra cautious when the church attaches itself formally to specific political policies, persons, and parties. Because if the church says, we are Republican, specifically speaking from the perspective of the church, you're basically telling everybody, in order to come to Jesus, you must become a Republican, right? And that's a mistake. It's a mistake. The church speaks on straight line issues, right? The church speaks on abortion. The church speaks on racism. The church speaks on things that the Bible says, this is wrong. But the church should be very careful when it engages in jagged line issues. Example. Talk to a guy. So again, personally, I don't understand how somebody can. Let me rephrase myself. In our current moment, right? So we are super divided. When you look at the Democratic Party has officially aligned itself with the culture of death. So for me, it's very difficult to understand how can somebody be a Christian and vote Democrat, right? So I had lunch with a guy this week who is a Christian and votes Democrat, and it was a very good conversation. The guy is a Christian. He's a solid Christian. He's a very thorough Christian. He's also extremely informed on politics. Most of his life, he was an active Republican. He was volunteering in the Trump campaign in 2016. He was born and bred conservative Republican guy. And he just made some arguments. He said, I think that based on my assessment, the crazy fringe radical left who hate religion, who want to impose LGBT rights on everybody, close down churches, whatever, the fringe progressive left is not the full Democratic Party. He said, I believe, based on my assessment, that most Democrats are centrist. Most Democrats are kind of middle of the road. And so, I challenged him on every question. But it was interesting because basically I was like, well, yeah, at the end of the day, this guy is very conservative. He just has a very different interpretation of what's going on. And I'm like, I still think he's wrong, but it's an interpretation, right? So politics in a broken world, as Christians, as the church, is full of this kind of back and forth. It's full of this kind of jagged line, gray areas, challenges, arguments, back and forth. Another example. I think, as much as I love guys like Doug Wilson, he's some of you guys know who he is, some of you have no idea who he is. He's a pastor, writes a bunch of really cool stuff, really enjoy his stuff, but he holds to a postmillennial eschatology. So, meaning his view of the end times is very different from what we Baptists grew up with. He believes that basically we'll keep evangelizing and the whole world is eventually going to become Christianized. And so when the Bible speaks about the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, it's actually talking about basically how the church is going to evangelize the world and the whole world is going to become Christian. So in his worldview, the governments of the world will eventually become all Christian. That's what he believes. That's what he believes the Bible teaches. I think it's very mistaken. But I also listen and I read people like him, and you realize that, okay, so he believes the governments are going to become Christian, and they're going to become good and solid. Jesus is going to be reigning through the governments in this world. So his expectation for politics in this world is very different than mine. And so he starts to he starts to blur the lines of the mission of the church to preach the gospel and the mission of the church to impact politics and Christianize politics. And again, I'm not saying that Doug Wilson has said anything horribly wrong in this sphere. I haven't read enough. But I have heard numerous things from people who believe what he believes, but this specific Christian perspective where if you expect the government to become Christian, then you are blurring the line. What is the goal of the church? Is the goal of the church to evangelize and make disciples? Or is the goal of the church to Christianize the government? Right? So, the church is called to make disciples, not Christianize governments. And the government is called to enforce justice, however imperfect that may be. Individual Christians, a little bit different though. Individual Christians are called to influence society both through the law and through evangelism, right? So constantly we see in the New Testament, Paul says in Romans, as much as depends on you, live at peace with all men. Uphold good laws. You know, the Old Testament talks about people upholding truth, justice in the land. So when we talk about the individual Christian living in the world, each of us individually, we are called to do both at the same time. We are called to try to impact society. Try to vote for good people. Try to, if you're called to that job, get into politics. Get into a voted position. Try to change things around and make it better, more according to God's just standards. And Christians are called to proclaim Jesus' lordship and the message of the gospel. And that also is a very political act. Let's think about this. We are used to thinking about politics as vote, or politics as Trump or Biden, or Inslee or Culp, or that's politics, right? But if you really think about politics, why do we care about those guys? Politics is really how we live in society. And how we behave and how we live is also political. So it's not just about voting, it's about behavior. It's about what kind of person you are, right? If you have a world full of selfish, angry, self-obsessed people, you're going to have more crime, right? If you have a world full of people who are loving, kind, love God's law, love their neighbor, you're going to have a better society without even enforcing more laws, right? So we have to understand that when we are evangelizing, when we are making disciples, we are impacting politics. We are impacting the society because when you bring somebody to Jesus, you are fundamentally altering their entire allegiance in their heart. You are changing their set of who they worship. And you are bringing the Word of God into their heart and causing God's justice and God's truth to be written on their heart. And that person gets saved, goes back into the world, lives as a Christian. He is impacting the world. He is impacting politics. Both of these methods are deeply political. When we say Jesus is king, we also imply Caesar is not Lord. We don't worship Caesar. So we will respect Caesar because God has ordained Caesar. But when Caesar tells us to worship him, we will not worship him. Right? So there's political implications in the church's job of making disciples. Politics goes down to our everyday life. Politics is how we treat our wife, our kids. Politics is how we treat our neighbors, how we relate to people around us, how we impact our town, our county. All of that is politics, right? And when you look at it from that perspective, you realize that in this broken world, there is only one solution for true political transformation, and that is when people get a new heart. When people get a new heart and Christ reigns in them, it's true transformation. You're not just imposing laws on people to control their sin. The law of God now reigns in their heart. That is the only true transformation of political change in this world on this side of brokenness that we see. So, this is a powerful, powerful force of the church. Now, it's interesting because we don't always, especially today, I think when we think about politics, we think, man, we got to make a political change. It means we got to vote. We got to get people registered to vote. We got to do that stuff. It's like voting is great. That's true. But when you look at history and you ask the question, when have Christians had the most powerful political impact? And you look at those periods of time, you realize they didn't do it through voting or legislature or getting Christians in power. They did it through evangelism. How did the church take over the Roman Empire in 300 years? How? By suffering, dying, evangelizing, loving neighbor. The force of the gospel spread. There's an interesting example also that a historian called, his name is Samuel Hugh Moffat. He writes about the history of the East, China, Mongolia, and in the 1300s. So in the 1300s, and probably Pastor Dimo would know this better because he knows missions history better. But that was an era, 1200s, 1300s, when the gospel was spreading through the East. It was spreading through China, through all those areas powerfully. And this guy, there was a ruler, a Mongol ruler named Tamerlane. Tamerlane was, what was he called? He was called like the destroyer or something. He started a persecution to end all persecutions. Tamerlane wanted to end Christianity. He wiped out millions of people, just slaughtering Christians everywhere. It was a straight up annihilation. But this historian, as he is analyzing that history, and he sees Christianity stopped in the 1300s in the East. And he analyzes, why did it stop? Most people would say, oh, it was because of this terrible persecution. It just killed all the Christians, and that's it. But he says this, he says, what finally withered the proud advance of Christianity across Asia was not the persecution of Tamerlane, though the permanent effects of that ravaging destruction still linger. More crippling than any persecution was the church's own long line of decisions to compromise evangelistic and missionary priorities for the sake of survival. So he says, as he's analyzing, he says the real reason that the church slowed down is because the church saw the push of persecution, and the church started to think, okay, how can we be more friendly to this? How can we be more connected, more in line, less offensive? And as the church started to prioritize that power and safety over evangelism, that is actually what stopped the advance of Christianity in Asia. So, as individual Christians who are individual members of God's kingdom, we are going into the world. We are called to impact the laws. That is very important. But we have to understand that our primary calling is number 2, and that is a political calling. When we impact neighbors with the gospel of Jesus Christ, that is the political impact, turning them to the true King, right? And why that's important is because your strategy in number 1, your strategy in voting, your strategy in getting involved in politics has to be determined by your strategy in number 2. If we don't understand that number 2 is our strategy, if we don't understand that discipleship is why we exist, and therefore whatever equips us to be more effective disciple makers, that's what we got to do in number 1. Then we will have number 1 take over number 2. Does that make sense? And that has happened a lot in the church in history. So I think I have a diagram. Yes. Both methods are ordained by God. Both are very important. but number two is why we exist, and number one serves number two. The very reason why we have laws is so that number two can happen, so that the gospel can go forward. And sometimes what that means in history, what that means is God permits terrible rulers, he permits persecution so that the gospel may go forth in a unique avenue. Sometimes God decides to do that. Sometimes God gives prosperity like we have right now. It's still prosperity, peace. We can assemble, we can do whatever we want. This is also an opportunity to proclaim the gospel, right? It returned us to that paradox that we noted earlier, right? We call people to the gospel. We call them to follow Jesus the King. And when people align themselves to the King, they then have a duty to set Christ above government, to set Christ above what the rulers demand from us. But at the same time, we respect the rulers. So, any questions on that? We are making very good progress. It's a lot of content, but we're moving along quicker than I thought. So, all of that adding up, how do we put it together to maybe some practical issues? What are our current dangers today for Christians? And again, the list that I made for you is just an approximate list. There's more. There's more things, right? And these things are not absolute. These things that you can push back and forth and discuss. But one thing for Americans is a very big temptation for American Christians, is aligning their Christianity too closely to a political party. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to vote Republican at all. But I am saying that when people align Jesus with a certain party, they are compromising the mission of the church. They're compromising because they're adding to the gospel. They're saying that if you want to become a Christian, you have to join this political party now. This gospel is only for Republicans. So if you want to come to Jesus, be a Republican, right? That's what the Jews did with the gospel as well. They said, if you want to be a Christian, follow Moses. It's interesting that when you look at history in America, until the 1970s, I read this, a historian guy was writing, a Christian historian. Until the 1970s, the Democratic Party actually was more opposed to abortion than the Republican Party. But in the 1970s, 1972, Roe v. Wade happened, and that legalized abortion in all 50 states because of the Supreme Court. It was a very political moment, and a lot of Christians were just it was a big deal, right? We just legalized abortion, and we didn't do it through voting. We did it through some judges that decided. Christians were inflamed. This is also the time when the Republican Party became more opposed to abortion than it was before. It harnessed the vote of the Christian bloc by aligning itself and saying we're going to be opposed to abortion. Now, does that mean that people in the Republican Party don't actually oppose abortion? They just do it for power? Some do. But some are truly opposed to abortion. There's really good Christians in there too, right? So it's not a clean-cut answer. You have people like Donald Trump. Do you think Donald Trump is personally opposed to abortion? No. He's paid for multiple abortions himself, right? But he all of a sudden became, on paper, opposed to abortion because it secures a voting bloc. Now, the other thing to consider, evangelical Christians in America are the most powerful voting bloc in the world. Evangelical Christians in America are the most powerful voting bloc in the world. Where evangelicals vote is one of the most powerful political moves in the whole world. So when you see people like Trump, who has had a very dirty life, and then all of a sudden he becomes the Republican nominee and he's opposed to abortion, obviously this is not an internal conviction of his. He's doing it because it gets him power. It gets him the votes, right? So when we look at the parties, when we look at what's going on around us, we can say, yeah, this one's corrupt, but this one's even more corrupt, right? And we need to learn to point out the flaws of the system rather than falling into this temptation. It's very tempting to desire to feel politically at home in one party or the other. And to feel like, oh, these are my people, and those are not. Those are the enemies, right? As Christians, we have to maintain the paradox. Politics in a broken world will always be broken. You will never have a perfect Christian political party in America. That's one of the thoughts that I had. It's like, okay, what if all the Christians got together and we made a Christian political party? Well, it wouldn't last more than 5 seconds because there's a lot of jagged line issues. There's a lot of truly disagreeing things. One author I was reading, he said this interesting event. He's a pastor, and he was doing an internship with one of the politicians in the UK. So he was in college. He went over there for a year to intern with this politician. And that politician was what we Americans would call conservative, financially and things like that. He went to church on Sunday in a British Anglican church, conservative church, Bible-believing church. And one of the old ladies asks him, hey, what are you doing here? You know, you're American, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm interning with this guy. And she's like, with him? You're interning with him? And you're a Christian? How can you do that? And he's like, what? Because he's like Republican from the South. Like, Christians are always conservative in this direction, right? Well, she's like, no. A lot of us Christians over here are more on the Democrat side because they are all about helping the poor and the needy. And the Bible talks about helping the poor and the needy all the time. So we're really about that. And so, again, he had disagreement, but he had this whole like moment where he had to realize that there was a lot of Christians who thought very differently about politics, borrowing on biblical principles too, coming to very different conclusions. So Jesus cannot be too closely aligned to any political party. And when you do that, you start to face dangerous territory and confusion to the mission of the church. Also, our political system today, because it's so polarized, both parties, if you observe closely, they demand all or nothing. They demand, so the parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, they're the ones who come out with an agenda. They come out with the things that they're going to stand for. And again, that's sort of, you can argue that's a reflection of what the people want, but the party still sets the agenda. As a Christian, you come, right, and you're like, well, what do I need to care about as a Christian, And I need to care about these things because the Bible cares about these things. But the party sets the agenda for you. So you got to go with whatever the party is picking, right? So it's very easy as Christians to become, if we're not thinking carefully about it, impacted and shaped by a political party and mixing that in with our Christianity and saying, these are our Christian values. For example, a lot of Christians get uncomfortable when somebody is teaching about racism, when somebody is teaching about helping the poor and underprivileged, helping single moms and people in bad neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, financially, and creating financial programs to help them. Right? A lot of Christians get really uncomfortable because that's not what the conservatives talk about, because we believe in financial independence, we believe in open market, we don't believe in social, using government money to help people too much because that sounds like socialism. But why do we get so edgy on these things? Is it because we've been conditioned by a party, or is it because we've been conditioned by Scripture to value things, right? So as Christians, we have to be conditioned what we believe on society by biblical values. And oftentimes, those biblical values will cause you to be aligned in some ways with these people and aligned with some ways with these people, right? So that's one of our dangers, though, especially in America. America has a big history of believing that it is God's chosen nation. A lot of the pilgrim pastors that came over here at the founding were post-millennial in their eschatology. So what we mentioned earlier. So they believed that they are setting up a Christian society. They believed they were called by God to go to America and to start this country, and from this country, the gospel will spread to the whole world. They actually believed that. And so they believed when Jesus, city on a hill passage in the Mount of in the Sermon on the Mount, the city on a hill and we're a light of the world. They quoted that, and they were quoting that talking about America, not talking about the church. So in American history, there's a lot of this intermixing, and a lot of unhealthy intermixing. What are our other dangers? There's many, but another thing that I'm sure we've seen: civility, respect, and commitment to truth. I think I divided them a little bit differently on your outline. Respect and self-control, right? Is that what it says on there? we see the war around us. People are angry, right? People in politics are very angry. They say nasty things at each other. They demonize each other. They speak of the other as if they are irrational, crazy, and dangerous, right? And the tactics that devolves down to is disrespectful, dirty politics, right? Smearing, fudging up details, making somebody look extra bad. That's our political world today. It's a fact. You just look at political rhetoric and it's just throwing dirt back and forth. There is very little good, healthy civil discourse, right? There's very little of that. But from a biblical perspective, we believe in the image of God in man. We believe that somebody could be totally wrong, but I'm going to respect them as God's creation. I'm going to speak to them. I'm going to try to convince them of the truth rather than devolving down to nastiness, anger, right? But that's our world. So we live in this political world, and that can become our thing. There is one prominent Christian, I'm not going to name him, one prominent Christian guy, Christian podcaster, writer, preacher, radio host guy, who many of you know his name. There's a video not too long ago where this guy, so my personal opinion of how he has handled the whole Trump thing is he's done a very bad job of thinking like a Christian, and he's gotten I think he's got a lot of connections with the White House because he's been promoting Trump. But there's a video of this dude walking out of a White House evening. There was some sort of special evening at the White House. And there's a guy from Portland riding his bike down the street, something terrible on his shirt. He's riding his bike, and he's just riding and just yelling, F Trump, F Trump. He's just swearing and saying bad things about the president. And this Christian leader guy jumps out onto the street and runs up behind the guy and punches him in the head. And the guy fell off his bike. So this dude is a preacher and a Christian radio host. And he's jumping out there in his tie and his suit and punching a guy who wasn't even touching him. And the guy fell off his bike. And then he jumps up and kind of yells at him, and Secret Service swarms the guy, but not this dude. So you have really, really terrible stuff happening when Christians get in bed with power, and then they are themselves, their behavior starts to become terrible because power is corrupting. So, religious secularism. It's another danger of today, right? We talk about this a lot. You probably don't need me to hear, talk about it too much, but this is a fact of our world, right? So we are witnessing how our society is systematically denying biblical values and denying Christianity and advancing a religious secular agenda. So as Christians, we have to figure out how we're responding to this. And we have to learn to talk to people who are very different than we are. I mean, it's one of the big challenges of the church today, right? It's nothing new for us. But I think one connected to that, did I not add it? Connected to that, I think I added it on your outline. Fear. I think a lot of Christians are afraid. And I think fear is a poison politically. Because when you're scared, you start to do things that you wouldn't have done if you weren't scared. And when you're scared, you start to be willing to compromise your principles more. You start to do things in a more desperate fashion that you would not have done. And you start to change your tactics. Now, when you look at how people talk on both sides, left and right, it is rampant equally on both sides. But one of the dominating things about both sides in our politics today is fear. They are trying to tell you, the Democrats are telling you that the Republicans are dangerous. They're dangerous to you. They're not just people who you disagree with. They're not just going to make bad policies. They're dangerous. The Republicans are saying the same thing about the Democrats, right? They are dangerous. If they get in power, the world's going to end. So today, a lot of people are scared. And fear is a political posture, and fear is anti-Christian. Paul tells Timothy that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of boldness and power and life in the Holy Spirit. So, as Christians, the way we're responding, so for example, if you're voting for somebody based on fear, that's not good. That's not healthy. If you're voting just because you're afraid of the other guy, and fear moves you to act this way, you're not thinking biblically. Christians are not supposed to be afraid. And again, it's easy to say that, right? But the world is messed up. We have families, kids, futures, right? Fear creeps in. But biblical posture in society is courage. You know, the Christians who stood up to the lions and the torches in Rome, I mean, that's courage. But that's political. And that equipped them to act properly in the midst of a very pressuring world. Same thing today. A lot of people are scared. And because they're scared, they're doing irrational things. They're doing things that they would never have done if they weren't scared. So, to quote Kanye, that's what he said in his interview, I think last week. I didn't listen to it, but it's a very interesting interview on Joe Rogan. He said, what would you do if you weren't afraid? More people need to be asking that question. What would you do if you weren't afraid? And that's an example of civility and respect and commitment to truth. You see something like the Joe Rogan podcast. It's very interesting. Joe Rogan, millions of people listen to this guy. But what does he believe? It's really hard to tell. He welcomes anybody. And it doesn't mean that he likes everybody in what they say and their beliefs. But he's welcomed Bernie Sanders, Jordan Peterson, everybody, Kanye West, and he listens to them, and he interacts, he dialogues. He brings the respect and the good questions. And in that, you see, I think honestly, as profane as he is, he uses a lot of bad words, and he endorses drugs. That's not good. I mean, he endorses certain things that Christians would be like, no way. But his attitude to ideas and other people that he disagrees with is something that Christians can learn from. He asks questions. He welcomes to the table. He brings conversations. And both liberals and conservatives are listening to Joe Rogan by the millions,